And welcome back. I'm Robert Breaker, missionary evangelist to the Spanish and English speaking people. And this week we're going to continue our verse-by-verse Bible study through the book of John. And today we're starting chapter 6. And I thought I had written it up here. I guess I didn't. We're going to start in John chapter 6 today. And there's a lot to get into in John chapter 6. Now, your Calvinists and your Catholics love to go to this passage. So we have to be careful. We don't want to fall into false doctrine. We don't want to become a Calvinist and believe something silly like men don't have free will. We also don't want to fall into false doctrine and believe what many of those in the Roman religion believe, that cannibalism is okay. No, God is not giving us here a cannibalistic doctrine of eating someone's flesh. It's a spiritual application. As we get into it, we'll see that. And we've just got to make sure that we always read the Bible. Always go by what the Bible says, not by what someone interprets it as saying. And that's one of the reasons why I love studying the Bible verse by verse, because when you study it verse by verse, you get it in context of what it's actually speaking about. So let's begin today in John chapter 6. And I think what I'll do is I'll read verse 1 through 14 through all the way. Then we'll go back and comment on it. So John chapter 6 and verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Now, I put a map up here, and I'll go more into detail on that here in a minute. But it says, after these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great multitude followed him, because they saw his miracles, which he did on them that were diseased. Now, we've seen some miracles already in the past chapters that we've gone through. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. And the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he saith unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread, that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Jesus is like, I'm going to do another miracle, but I'm going to have a little fun with this guy. Hey, what do you think? You know, it was the Lord teaching him something. Basically teaching him to rely upon him, the Lord, than upon man or upon money. Verse 7, Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto him, There's a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? And Jesus said, Make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down. In number about 5,000. And we're going to see here in a little bit, there was more than just men. It was men and then others. And then it says, And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples to them that were set down, and likewise of the fishes as much as they would. When they were filled, he said unto his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together, and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, This is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. So this is a miracle. We call this the miracle, the feeding of the 5,000. And we'll see here in a minute that this takes place in all 4 Gospels. Now there's this thing called, what is it called? The parallel Bible or something like that. It's a companion of all the Gospels. And some of the things mentioned in John are not mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And sometimes something's mentioned in Luke that's not mentioned in Mark and Matthew and John. But there are some things in all 4 Gospels that are mentioned, and this is one of those. The feeding of the 5,000 is found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we'll look at that here in a minute. And I think it's important because it's a type of something that already took place and something that will take place in the future. And we will see all that, I believe. But let's go back to verse 1 and start here verse by verse. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Now, Galilee is this area here that I've outlined in green, and it looks like green doesn't show up very well in this camera, but this is the territory of Galilee, okay? This is the Sea of Tiberias, or the Sea of Galilee. Now down here is Jerusalem. So from Jerusalem up there is pretty far. And so up here is where they went, and there were 2 cities that we need to know the names of, Capernaum and Bethsaida. And so Capernaum is over on this side, and Bethsaida is more over on that side. And we see them traveling by boat back and forth. And this is the River Jordan, and eventually comes down to here, the Dead Sea. Now, my map skills are not the best, but I'm getting a little better, aren't I? At drawing maps, I hope anyway. So the Sea of Tiberias is also called the Sea of Galilee. It has two names. Now, let's go to Matthew chapter 4, because in the book of Matthew, we find that this is where Jesus met for the first time his disciples. So he's going back to the place where he found them. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 13, probably so they can go see their family, I guess. And Jesus can see his family, I presume. But Matthew chapter 4, verse 13. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is upon the seacoast in the borders of Zebulun and Naphtali. And that it might be fulfilled which is spoken by Isaiah, that's Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Nephilim by the way of the sea beyond Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people which sat in darkness saw great light. And to them which sat in the region and shadow of death, light is sprung up. From that time Jesus began to preach and to say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. He's preaching the kingdom gospel. And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, so he's over here somewhere, walking by that sea, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brethren, Simon, called Peter, and Andrew, his brother. Okay, we just read about Andrew. Casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he saith unto them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And they straightway left their nets and followed him. And going on from thence, he saw two other brethren, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in a ship with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. And he called them. And they immediately left the ship and their father, and followed him. And Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all manner of sickness and all manner of disease among the people. And on and on and on. So we see Jesus there, and then he comes back. So why would Jesus go down here and then go back? Well, if you know your Bible, the Jews had to come to Jerusalem every so often. I think there were 3 major feasts in which they had to appear in Jerusalem. That's a pretty good walk. And they walked. And I'll maybe give you a little bit of the distance here in a second, how far it is. But it says back in John chapter 6, that Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great multitude followed him. So when Jesus left Jerusalem and went up there, all these people followed him. Why do you think they followed him? Because they wanted more miracles. They wanted to see what he was doing, because the common people thought, man, this is the Messiah. But the religious leaders said, nah, we don't think so. So Jesus said, forget the religious leaders. They're deceived anyway. I'll try to help the people. Well, as we see in chapter 6, when Jesus tries to help the people, all they want is help physically, and they don't care about spiritual things. And yet Jesus comes to them and says, no, you don't get it. I'm here to help you spiritually with your spiritual needs, and not so much physical things. And we actually see what appears to be Jesus getting a little bit mad, a little angry, if you will, at them for being so dense, if you will, because they're thinking only of the physical, and Jesus is saying, look, dudes, it's the spiritual that I'm trying to explain to you. And I don't think they get it. But verse 2 says, and a great multitude followed him, because they saw his miracles which he did on them that were diseased. So he's doing miracles, and they wanted more of those miracles. Why? Because the Jews seek after signs. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now, where's the mountain? I don't know. There's mountains all around here. But somewhere in between these two areas, he was in a mountain someplace, and it was a place with a lot of grass. I would love to go there someday and try to find that place where Jesus was sitting and teaching. It's still there. I've heard of tours that take you to places like that and show you over there. But he went up into a mountain. Jesus was a mountain climber. He said, you know what, I'm going to go up into the mountain. I wonder why. Well, if you've ever been around a lake with mountains, you get a beautiful view when you go up in the mountain and look down on the lake. It's gorgeous. I love to go up into high places and look and see the view. It's just gorgeous, just gorgeous. And so Jesus had left Jerusalem. Now, how far? Well, from Jerusalem up to around this area, Capernaum, is about 121 kilometers. Now, I'm American and I speak English, so we don't use kilometers, so I had to look that up and do a little conversion. It's about 75 miles. So how long did it take Jesus to get from here to here walking? I walked one day 10 miles in about a couple hours. So I think you could easily walk 20 miles a day. So about a 3-day walk. So Jesus was walking, and I guess he walked for about 3 days to get up there. Isn't that something? 3 days? That's about what it would equal to. Now in those days, they walked everywhere. So they probably could have walked 30 miles in one day, perhaps. But if you're used to walking, you could walk. I used to read stories of a guy in England that would walk something like 30 miles a day. So you can walk that far, especially if you don't have a car and you don't have a horse in your whole life. You walk. You're used to walking long distances. And that's a far distance for Jesus to travel from there to there, about 75 miles. And what happened? Well, it says in verse 4, and the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was nigh. Now, what does it mean to be nigh? It means soon. So the Passover was coming up soon. But what do you do at the Passover? Well, you had to come back to Jerusalem. So he walked up there a couple of days' walk, and now pretty soon, I don't know how nigh, but it says nigh, so that means soon, he's going to have to turn around and walk back to Jerusalem because he needs to be in Jerusalem at the Passover. In verse 5, when Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he saith unto Philip, and then it goes on there. But look at what it says there. So it tells us what the Sea of Galilee is. It's the Sea of Tiberias. It tells us that Jesus went there and a multitude followed him. It tells us verse 3, he went up in a mountain. And then it tells us in verse 5, and then he lifted up his eyes. What was he walking like this the whole way? I think he went up in a mountain and then he got down on his knees and was praying. And that's why the Bible says, and then he lifted up his eyes and looked, and guess what? There were all the people. So when it says that he lifted up his eyes, I think the reason is he was probably on his knees praying. And we see that in a lot of passages in Jesus going somewhere. He'd go out into a place and pray. And he tried to get to a place where he was away from people. But then it says he lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him. He saith unto Philip, when shall we buy bread that these may eat? So Jesus must be in a very desolate, far away place, kind of way away from a place to go buy food. And he looks out there and he sees a vast multitude of, guess how many people? Verse 10, about 5,000. Now that doesn't include the women and children, so there were probably way more. 6,000, 7,000, if you include the men's wives, maybe even 10,000. So there's a lot of people there, but the Bible says that 5,000 men. So at least 5,000 men were there. That's a lot of people. And the first thing Jesus thinks is, we need to feed these people. And he looks over at Philip and he says, hey Philip, what do you think? Now Philip is from John chapter 1. Remember? John chapter 1 verse 43. John 1:43. The day following, Jesus would go forth unto Galilee and findeth Philip and saith unto him, follow me. Now Philip was of Bethsaida, from this area. And it says, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip findeth Nathanael and saith unto him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael said unto him, can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? Philip saith unto him, come and see. And it goes on there talking about Philip, but this was Philip, the same Philip. So why Jesus signals him out of all his 12 disciples, I don't know. But he says, hey Philip, when shall we buy bread that these may eat? Now verse 6 says, and this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Jesus is looking at Philip and going, Philip, you believe I'm the Messiah, and you've seen all the miracles that I do. Hey Philip, where are we going to get all the bread to help these people? And Philip speaks up, well, I think we need to do this because we need this much money. And Jesus is kind of probably chuckling, I'm going to do a miracle. That was a rhetorical question. I want you to see what I'm about to do. And what he does is miraculously turns 5 loaves and 2 fishes into enough food to feed everyone. And they took up like 12 baskets full of food after. How did he do that? I don't know, but it was a miracle. It's probably like every time they pulled off a piece of bread, they looked back and it was whole again. They pulled off another piece and it was whole again. And it just kept multiplying. I don't know how that worked with the fish. Jesus probably had the 2 fishes and he closed the basket and prayed. And when he opened it up, there was like 20 fishes. And they're like, how did that happen? Well, it's a miracle. Jesus did a miracle. So look what it says here. Verse 6. And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. So I guess this fellow is pretty smart. And he looks at all those people, and he must have estimated there's about 5,000. And he comes up and he says, so even if we had 200 penny worth of bread. Now a penny is what? 1/100th of something. So 200 penny worth would be what? Would be $2. Now, we are a highly inflated world we live in. Things now are way more expensive than they were in the old days. In the old days, back in the 1800s, you'd work for a penny a day. Then, things went higher, 50 cents a day, $1 a day. But in the Greek language, people will point out in this passage, when it says penny, they say, well, the word in Greek is denarius. Well, what is a denarii or denarius? It's a little silver coin that's about the size of a dime. And the Bible tells us that when people worked for a day, that was a day's wage, a denarius. And we find that in history too. So a little size of a dime piece of silver was a day's wage. Matter of fact, let me show you that. Let's go to Matthew chapter 20. And see, some people will make fun of the Bible and say, oh, it should say denarius, not penny. And I go, no, the Bible defines itself, and God wanted it to say penny for a reason. And about the time that the King James Bible came out, that's about what a penny was. A penny was a day's wage. So the people understood that. And I think I understand it, and you do too if you read the whole Bible. And it just makes sense. You don't have to run to the Greek, okay? But I just wanted you to know that that's what the word is. And I don't believe in correcting the King James Bible. I believe the King James Bible defends itself. And look what it says in Matthew chapter 20, verse 1. For the kingdom of heaven is likened to a man that is a householder, which went out early in the morning to hire laborers in his vineyard. And when he had agreed with the laborers for a penny a day, he sent them into his vineyard. So it's talking there about a day's wage is about a penny. So when you go back to the passage in John and you start reading that, you go, so he's saying about working for 200 days, that's 3/4 of a year basically, you still wouldn't have enough money to feed all these people. So that got me thinking, okay. I took 200 divided by 5,000, and that's 0.04 cents per person. So I'm like, even if you had 4 cents per person. But then again, I mean, if a cent is a penny, So he had a pretty good average. I think he overestimated what the price might be. But if it's a day's wage is a penny, the average salary in America in 2021 was about $47,520. So let's just round it up to $50,000. Now this is in America. I don't know what the salary in other countries are, but I'm going off the average salary in America is about $50,000. Now you divide 50,000 by 12, that comes to about $4,166 a month. So that's a lot. $4,166 a month. Divide that by 30, and that comes out to about $138.86 a day. And that's about the going rate. I've talked to people, that they want to hire somebody to work for them. It's about how much is the going rate? Oh, $100 a day. With our inflation, that's kind of low. People probably should get more. But you take that, $138 and whatever cents, multiply that by 200. Because we figured this out, a penny is a day's wage, so he says 200 penny worth, or 200 days working, all total, probably wouldn't pay for enough food for 5,000 people. So I took 138 point, whatever the change was, times 200, and that comes out to $27,600. So when Jesus says, hey, I want to feed all these people, he's sitting there going, man, we need like $27,600 if we're going to feed all these people. So you take $27,600, divide that by 5,000, and you get about $5.52 per person. Boy, you're doing good nowadays in America to be able to get a meal for $5. A lot of your fast food joints, and I don't like to go to fast food joints because it's processed food, but man, your average meal is $8, $10. So around $5.52 per person. Now a loaf of bread is about $2.50 in America. The average price of a loaf of bread, and that's the not so good bread, the bleached bread, is about $2.50 a loaf. So you take 27,600 and divide that by about 250, and you come up with 11,040 loaves of bread. Well, that would be about 2 loaves for every person. So that's me. I'm not good at math. I don't like math, but for fun, I thought, man, if this was today, how much money would you need to feed about that many people, 5,000 people? And I came up with, man, you probably need about $27,000 to feed them all. And you'd have about 2 loaves for every person with a little bit left over. So what a question that Jesus answers. Jesus says, hey, Philip, I'd like to feed all those people. And Philip probably didn't go, well, okay, let me figure out the math. He probably went, Lord, do you know it'd be like about $27,000 to feed all those people? And the Lord goes, yeah, I know. And the Lord, like it says, is proving him and trying him and saying, hey, do you believe I can do that? Well, let's look at this. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. He's like, 200 pennyworth isn't even enough, because it wasn't just a man, it was his wife and kids too. So try feeding a family for about $5.52 today. So yeah, I can see Philip's side, but I can also see the Lord's side, because the Lord is going, dude, I'm going to do it. You just watch. I'm doing this. Watch what I do. Verse 8, I love this. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, saith unto him, there is a lad here with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? So old Andrew speaks up and says, well, Lord, we don't have anything, but I know you can make a lot out of nothing. And I've seen you do miracles, so I wonder if in the back of his mind, if Andrew wasn't going, I wonder if the Lord can do something with this. And he says, here's what we got. We got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. 7 all total, 7 somethings to eat. God always uses the number 7. So Andrew speaks up and says, hey, how about this? And verse 10 says, and Jesus said, make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. Now we're going to read this in the other passages, okay? Because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we read about this feeding of 5,000, and we get added details. We get more details about it. So let's go to Matthew chapter 14. I want you to see it in the other places, because there's just a little bit more detail here. Every one of the Gospels has a different detail added, and you don't really see the whole picture until you see them all together. So Matthew 14:13. Matthew 14:13. When Jesus heard of it, he departed thence by ship into a desert place apart. And when the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of the cities. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude, and was moved with compassion toward them, and he healed their sick. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, this is a desert place, and the time is now past. Send the multitude away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves victuals. But Jesus said to them, they need not depart. Give ye them to eat. And they say unto him, we have here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He said, bring them hither to me. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake and gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. I can see him taking the bread and like breaking it in half and putting it in a basket. And when he comes back over, it's another loaf, full loaf. And somehow God was able to make that into more. And it says here in verse 20, and they did all eat and were filled, and they took up of the fragments that remained 12 baskets full. That's interesting, because the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus Christ came to the Jews, to the 12 tribes of Israel. And they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, beside women and children. So let's just say half of the men brought their wives. And let's just say there were 1,000 kids there. That's 8,000. I mean, how many were there total? There were a bunch. There could have been potentially 10,000 people there, men and his wife, plus kids. So it could have been over 10,000 perhaps. But the Bible chooses to record 5,000 men, and then there were also some women and children. It doesn't tell us. So that's one passage. Now let's go over to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. So we see it wasn't just men eating. He fed the women as well. Mark chapter 6 and verse 30, and the children. And let me back up to the young lad, it said, that had the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Number 1, where were his parents? And number 2, what was he doing there by himself with food? They were out kind of in the wilderness. I don't know, but it sounds like me when I was a kid. When I was a kid, man, I didn't come home till after dark sometimes. I would be out playing. I'd be out doing stuff. I'd take food with me. I'd go I wouldn't camp, but I'd take camping things. I'd be all over the place on my own by myself, and then I'd come home. So I bet that kid was like that, probably doing his own thing and then coming back home at night. And it's because I lived in a safe place where you can do that. Now, I don't think I'd let my kids do that. Get on a bike and go 2 miles that way and 2 miles that way and, not know where they are, because we live in a pretty bad time now. But when I was a kid, it wasn't that bad, and it was fun to be able to have the freedom that I did as a child to be able to go around places like that. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 30. Matthew 6 and verse 30. And he said unto them, Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. And they departed into a desert place by ship privately, and the people saw them departing, and many knew him, and ran afoot thither out of all cities, and outwent him, and came together unto him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw much people, and was moved with compassion toward them, because they were as sheep not having a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, This is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away, that they may go into the country round about and into the villages, and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. He answered and said unto them, Give ye them to eat. And they said unto him, Shall we go and buy 200 pennyworth of bread, and give them to eat? He said to them, How many loaves have ye? Go and see. When they knew, they say, 5 and 2 fishes. And he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the grass. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. You see the added details? You have to take all the accounts together to see the whole picture. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed and brake the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fishes divided he among them all. And they did all eat and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments. And they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men. Okay? And also others as well. Now, let's go to Luke chapter 9 and read this as well. Luke chapter 9. And in Luke chapter 9, verse 10 through 17. And the apostles, when they were returned, told him all they had done, and he took them and went aside privately into a desert place belonging to the city called Bethsaida. Bethsaida. I love to say Bethsaida. Saida. Reminds me of Honduras. In Honduras there was a city called Saiba. And you don't just call it La Ceiba. It's La Ceiba. It's just the accent that they had. Saiba. And there was an island off the coast, 3 of them. Wanaha, Rotan, and Utila. And a lot of white people that were from origin of England. English origin. Actually, they're pirates. A lot of them, their ancestors were pirates. They would speak English and Spanish. And there's several times I took the little boat, the little launch out to those places, and I'd hear them talk, and they'd say, I go Saiba. And it's just funny to hear them say Saiba. It's just funny. But that's what I hear when I hear Bethsaida, Saiba, Bethsaida. There's some words like that are just fun to me and for me to pronounce. But Luke chapter 9 and verse 10. And the apostles, when they returned, told him all that they had done, and he took them and went aside privately into a desert place belonging to the city called Bethsaida. And the people, when they knew it, followed him, and he received them and spake unto them of the kingdom of God, and healed them that had need of healing. And when the day began to wear away, then came the 12, and said unto him, Send the multitude away, that they may go into the towns and country round about, and lodge, and get victuals, for we are here in a desert place. So they were away from a lot of things. And he said unto them, Give ye them to eat. They said, We have no more but 5 loaves and 2 fishes, except we should go and buy meat for all this people. For they were about 5,000 men, and he said to his disciples, Make them sit down by 50s in a company. And they did so, and made them all sit down. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, looking up to heaven, he blessed them and brake, and gave to the disciples to set before the multitude. And they did eat, and were all filled, and there was taken up of fragments that remained to them 12 baskets. So there you have the 3 other places that this is mentioned. And then, of course, Luke chapter 6. So 4 times we have the feeding of the 5,000. And the feeding of 5,000 is found quite a few times. Now, why is that? Why is the feeding of the 5,000 so important? Well, here's the cross, and here's Jesus in his earthly ministry. So here's the feeding of the 5,000 right here. But back here with Moses, remember when they were in the wilderness, the Jews in the wilderness? And do you remember in the Old Testament that God fed them there. He fed them quail and manna in the wilderness. So let's write here, manna. So you have that. But over here, after the rapture of the church, guess what we have? We have the tribulation period. Whoops, I wrote a little wrong there. Let me fix that. And during the tribulation period, before Jesus returns at Armageddon, there's going to be a feeding here. And it's going to be a feeding of Jews in the tribulation who are protected. So this is to remind us of that, but also to point forward to Jesus protecting and feeding the Jews in the time of Jacob's trouble. Let me show you that in Revelation chapter 12 very quickly. Revelation chapter 12. When the Antichrist comes on the scene, he's going to kick the Jews out of their temple and out of Jerusalem, and they're going to have to flee. And look what it says here. Revelation 12:1. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she being with child, travailing in birth, and pain to be delivered. Now this woman is Israel. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, and they should feed her there 1,260 days. That's 3.5 years. So that's the last 3.5 years of the tribulation period. And notice what it says there in that verse. That they should feed her there. So there's another feeding. So just as God in the wilderness fed Moses and his people, the Jews, showing them that he cared and they were his people and he would protect them, Jesus did the same thing here in a desert place, in a wilderness. And God's not done with the Jews. These people out there talk about, oh, replacement theology. God's done with the Jews. All the promises are for us. God's never going back to dealing with the Jew. You don't read your Bible. God is going to get those Jews in the wilderness again, and he's going to feed them again. He's going to protect them one last time. So that's an interesting thing. I find that quite interesting, that what Jesus did here was a type of this back here and of this over here. And if you read your Bible, well, you see things like that. And I look for things like that when I read my Bible. So back to John chapter 6. John chapter 6, verse 9. There is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many? Well, a lot and enough. Because it was enough for God to use to make a miracle to be able to feed them. Now verse 10, and Jesus said, make the men sit down. Well, we know from the other account, they sat down in hundreds. So it doesn't tell us that here, but reading the others, we know that. Oh wow, God told them, go sit down in company of 50, in company of 100, and then the disciples went out and fed them. And then it says here, make the men sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And when Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were set down, and likewise of the fishes as much as they would. When they were filled, he said unto his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Now, I don't know what that was all about. I don't know what they did with the fragments. But they got them, and they took the ones that remained. And then in verse 13, therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. So then they had some leftovers, if you will. That's where we get our word leftovers from, what was left over. And now in verse 14, then those men, when they had seen the miracle that Jesus did, said, this is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. So because of this miracle of miracles, which by the way, this miracle was done by Jesus, the Son. This miracle, Jesus is going to tell us here, was by the Father, which I find interesting. So what does that make this miracle over here? Is this the Holy Spirit, perhaps? I don't know, but it's so weird that you find 3 all the time through the Bible, because we know God is one God in 3, but these 3 are one. But we'll continue reading here, but look at verse 14, they said, we know that he is that prophet. That prophet is a saying that the Jews used in reference to their Messiah or the Christ. And let me show you that. They knew from the prophecy of Daniel that the Christ was coming, that the Messiah was coming around that time. And we go back to the book of Deuteronomy, and it talks about the prophet that will come. So all the Jews were looking for the prophet, and they were probably all talking about it in their synagogues. The Messiah, the prophet, is coming soon. And where was he prophesied of? Deuteronomy chapter 18. Deuteronomy 18, 18 and 19 says, I will rise them up a prophet, capital P. Look at verse 15. The Lord thy God will rise up unto thee a prophet, it says, from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me, unto him ye shall hearken. Now verse 18, I will rise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I command him. And it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my words, when he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. So this prophet is the Messiah, and he's coming with what? Words. This is very important, because they are supposed to listen to the words of that prophet when he comes. And those would be the words of Jesus Christ, who came to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So when we talk about that prophet, clearly that's talking about the Messiah or the Christ. Go back with me real quick to John chapter 1. Whenever John the Baptist showed up, John chapter 1, verse 21. The Pharisees asked him this. John chapter 1, verse 21. They asked him, what then? Art thou Elias? Or Elijah? Elias? And he saith, I am not. Art thou that prophet? And he answered, no. Now look at verse 25. And they asked him, and said unto him, why baptizest thou then, if thou be not that Christ, neither Elias, neither that prophet? That prophet is the prophesied coming Messiah. And that's who Jesus is. And when he fed them that food, that bread, then they believed. So Jesus Christ comes and he gives them bread, and they say, okay, we believe he's the Messiah. And we're going to see that a little farther on, because now they're like, yeah, he gave us food. Oh, we'll believe him. But you got to be careful. People are fickle. That's called mob rule. There's a mob there. And as long as you keep them fed, they're happy. If you quit feeding them, they turn on you. Communists have learned that, haven't they? Communism can't keep its people fed very much. And so communism is always destined to fail. So Jesus is giving them something physical, food, and they're like, yeah, we love you, man. Whatever you say, dude, you're him. Yeah, we good. And that, as long as they're getting fed, they're happy. But as we read the rest of John chapter 6, we find out that they don't really believe who Jesus is. They're just there for the free handout. They want the welfare. They want the handout. They want to be given something for nothing. They don't really believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So let's continue there in verse 15. My Bible has a paragraph mark, so this is a new thought or a new story. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him king, they departed again into the mountain himself alone. So they said, we want to make him our king, man. He's cool. He gives us food. Do you know how many times in the history of the world a man comes along and gives away stuff to people, wanting them to vote for him or wanting them to be the king or something, and yet when he takes over, then he doesn't give them anymore. He just takes from them. Well, Jesus came giving, but he's giving even more. He's giving himself on the cross. And they don't realize that he's come to give them all. He's to give them his own blood to pay for their sins. No, all they want is that food. They don't care about that. And that's sad. So they're seeing the physical, but they're not looking at the spiritual side of Jesus and the big picture, which is he came to die on the cross. But they wanted to make him king. Now, it was not his time yet. So what happens? Verse 15, when Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force and make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. So Jesus got away. He said, no, it's not time for you to make me king. I got to do something first. I got to die in your place for your sins before I can be king. So he got away from them and went up by himself. Now verse 16, and when even was now come, his disciples went down unto the sea. And then what they do? Verse 17, and entered into a ship, and went over the sea toward Capernaum, and it was now dark, and Jesus was not come to them. So here is Bethsaida, and here is Capernaum. So they're going over the sea. So they're going, I can see if I can make a little thing here. They're cutting across there. Yeah, I guess you can see that. They cut across from one side to the other. Now they didn't go in the very middle, but they went from here to here across. But when they went across, number one, they went across without Jesus. And number two, they ran into a storm. They ran into a very big storm. And boy, oh boy, did they get scared. The end of verse 17, went over the sea toward Capernaum, and it was now dark, and Jesus was not come to them. And the sea arose by reason of a great wind that blew. So Jesus went up on a mountain, and the disciples went down, because they were up on a little bit higher on the mountain, and they went down. So up, and they went down. Interesting. And they're out in this great wind that blew. Now verse 19, so when they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs, they see Jesus walking on the sea and drawing nigh to the ship, and they were afraid. So they are seeing Jesus walking on the water, and they're like, what is that? They were afraid. What were they afraid of? Well, I don't know if they recognize it as Jesus at first, because I'm going to take you to the companion passage here in a minute of this. But let's go to what it actually says there in verse 19. Look at how long they had rowed. And they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs. So 5 and 20 is 25. So they went 25 or 30 furlongs rowing in a boat. Now I know a little bit about this because I grew up on the water, and I live exactly 1 mile from the end of the point that we live on. And one day I got in a boat and I rowed to the end of the point. It took me 1 hour to row 1 mile without much wind. And so I thought, man, that's kind of cool to know that I can go 1 mile an hour in a boat, because I guess the current or whatever. And I said, that's neat. So with that, for me, in my experience, I said, maybe I can figure out how long they were rowing for. A furlong is about 1/8 of a mile. Well, 1/8 in fractional form, if my math is right, and I hate math, is 0.125. So if it was 25 furlongs that they rowed, then they went about 3.125 miles. If it was 30 that they went, then they went about 3.75 miles. So they're about 3.5 miles, okay? Well, 3.5 hours? If I could do an hour and a mile an hour, then maybe they did in the storm. So maybe they're out there 3 or 4 hours, maybe longer. Maybe the storm was blowing them back, and that's why it took so long. But remember, this is all taking place at even, and they left at even. So even what, 6 o'clock? Let's say it's 7 o'clock. 8, 9, 10, 11. Let's say it's about 11 or 12 maybe. So when Jesus comes to them, it's about midnight. Jesus was up on the mountain praying till about midnight, and then he comes walking across the water to them. Now let's look at that in Mark chapter 14. I want you to see the other gospel that tells about this, Mark chapter 14, because always we get more details when we read the other gospels. Mark chapter 14. So it's amazing to me to try to connect the dots with my limited knowledge of rowing and boats and ships, and we live on a bay, so I know what it's like to live by water. But Mark chapter 14 and verse 22. Matthew 14, my bad. I said Mark. Matthew 14:22. Sometimes I write down in my notes wrong. Matthew 14:22. That's what we want. Matthew 14:22. Okay. Matthew 14:22. And straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and go before him unto the other side while he sent the multitudes away. So Jesus is here, goes up the mountain after sending away the multitudes, and they start coming across here. And then it says, and when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray, and when the evening was come, he was there alone. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night. Now the fourth watch of the night, when would that be? Well, that sounds like that's pretty early in the morning, so past midnight even. They're out there having a hard time. And look what it says here. And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went into them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It is a spirit, and they cried out for fear. But straightway, Jesus spake unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me to come unto thee on the water. Peter's like, man, another miracle. He's walking on the water. I want to walk on water. So what happens? And he said, Come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried, saying, Lord, save me! A lot of people today, they preach what I call a bloodless gospel. They preach another gospel, not the gospel of salvation by faith in the blood. And a lot of people today, they say, if you want to be saved, just say what Peter said, Lord, save me. This is not salvation of your soul. This is, Lord, I'm about to sink to the bottom of the ocean here, of the sea, and I'm scared, save me physically. He's calling out to God saying, save me physically, not save my soul. And look at what happens. Verse 31, And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him, and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? And when they were come into the ship, the wind ceased. Then they that were in the ship came and worshipped him, saying, Of a truth, thou art the Son of God. And then when we were gone over, they came into the land of Gennesaret. So they were doubting, it sounds like, while they're rowing that boat. And they're going, man, is he really the Son of God? I mean, is he really the one that we're supposed to be? I mean, is he really? They're kind of like wondering about it. But then they go, man, yeah, he's for sure. He's it. He is. So back to John chapter 6. Look at all that's going on. John chapter 6 in verse 20. All right, verse 19 is where they're rowing. Verse 20, But he saith unto them, It is I, be not afraid. Then they willingly received him into the ship, and immediately the ship was at the land whither they went. Now that sounds like another miracle. As soon as Jesus got in the ship, boom, all of a sudden they're right there at the beach. That's pretty cool. So miracle after miracle after miracle Jesus is doing. And this was a really neat miracle. And I just love that it says, and immediately the ship was at the land. It sounds almost like type of the rapture, doesn't it? At the last trump, in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, Jesus gets in the ship and boom, you're where you're supposed to be. Boy, I'm waiting for that rapture. I'm in a ship right now, rolling around in storms on this earth and sinking. And I'm like, man, Lord, come back. And I'm looking for Jesus to come on the sea. I'm looking for Jesus to come at the rapture, because he'll take me out and immediately I'll be on the shore with him at the rapture. And I'm looking forward to that. Boy, what a blessing that'll be. So, verse 22, The day following, when the people which stood on the other side of the sea saw that there was none other boat there, save that one whereunto his disciples were entered, and that Jesus went not with his disciples into the boat, but that his disciples were gone away alone, howbeit there came other boats from Tiberias nigh to the place where they did eat bread, after that the Lord had given thanks. When the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, neither his disciples, they also took shipping and came to Capernaum seeking for Jesus. So they're over here, and now they're coming back over there the next day. Well, the next day the storm had subsided, so it must have been calm. And so they're coming across because they want to see Jesus again. Why would they want to see Jesus again? Because they wanted food. Hey, he's the guy that fed us. Let's go see if he'll feed us again. Well, he did a miracle and made a whole lot of food, and it was good. Let's go see if he'll give us more. You start giving people stuff, they want more and more and more, and they take from you. And you've got to be careful not to let people take advantage of you. It sounds like they wanted to take advantage of Jesus. So what happened next? Well, verse 25. All right, so they're all in Capernaum now. They came to Capernaum seeking for Jesus. This is Capernaum on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Tiberias. And in verse 25, And when they had found him on the other side of the sea, they said unto him, Rabbi, when camest thou hither? Now there was a time discrepancy that they couldn't figure out. Lord, when did you get here? Because he left, but they watched the disciples leave and Jesus go another way. And then they're like, well, he didn't have enough time to walk over here. I think the reason they take the boat is because the boat's faster than walking. And so they're like, we don't understand. There wasn't enough time for you to get here, because we would have, It was weird. So that goes back to verse 21, and immediately the ship was at the land. It almost sounds like somehow God just, well, he has power and control over time, I guess. And he can do whatever he wants, but they're sitting there going, there's something strange here. I mean, not only how did you get here, but when did you get here? And how were you able to get here in the time that you did? Well, he's God. He's God. And so they said, when camest thou hither? In verse 25. Now let's look at verse 26. Jesus answered them and said, verily, verily, I say unto you, ye seek me not because ye saw the miracles, but because ye did eat of the loaves and were filled. Now Jesus begins to rebuke. So we see him at first caring, and we see because he cares, because he loves them, he fed them. But over here, we see Jesus a little bit different. He begins to rebuke them. Because Jesus did what he did because he cared in order to teach them. And he was all about him wanting to teach them. But it appears that what Jesus saw was that when he taught them what he was trying to teach them, they didn't get it. And so over here, Jesus is a little bit angry, it appears, because they're not getting the message that he's trying to give them. All they're wanting is more food. Gimme, 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 gimme. Give me some more, give me some more. They're very carnal. And Jesus is like, man, I'm here to help your spiritual needs. Why are you trying to take so much from me? Is what it looks like from this. Verse 26, Jesus answered them and said, verily, verily, I say unto you, ye seek me not because you saw the miracles, but because you did eat of the loaves and were filled. All they wanted was a handout. Verse 27, labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you, for him hath God the Father sealed. Then said they unto him, what shall we do that we might work the works of God? And there's a lot more that I need to get into. I'll probably start on this the next time that we do this, because I want to get through this, and I think I need to have time to get through this for the next one. So I'll stop there. We'll go ahead and stop there in verse, well, we'll call it verse 27, and we'll start next time in verse 28. But I want you to see what we saw here. We saw quite a few miracles by Jesus. Not just the feeding of the 5,000 was a miracle. Walking on water was a miracle. Immediately being on the shore was a miracle. There were a lot of miracles going on there. Breaking the bread and it becoming a miracle. And by the way, when I say bread, when we talk about bread, a lot of people think of what looks like this, a loaf of bread. That's what we think of today, because that's how we cook bread. If you slice it, it looks kind of like that. But in Jesus' day, bread was round, and it was like a thin pizza crust. And so they would break it like this, and they would tear it into pieces, and they would eat it. So look into that kind of bread. One of the things that I've liked to do is we have a place here in Pensacola called Taste of Jerusalem. And the man came from Jerusalem, and he makes, 3 different kinds of food. He makes Muslim food, he makes Jewish food, and he makes Greek Orthodox or something like that. But it's the kind of food that they eat in Jerusalem. And I went there, and we also have another place called Phaneris Brothers, which is wonderful, a Greek restaurant, so Mediterranean food. And when you eat that kind of food, it kind of makes you think of the kind of food that they would have eaten back then. And the kind of food in the Mediterranean, bread, is this flat, round piece. Usually it's about this big around. A flat, round piece of stamped out barley or flour or wheat. And it's made like this in an oven where they stick it to the side. And when it comes out, it looks like a pizza crust. And you break that. The thing to compare it to today would be pita bread, if you know what pita bread is. That's the kind of bread. So I always thought when I first got saved and was reading the Bible that they've got a big old loaf of bread, like this is what it would look like sliced. This is what it looked like when it was cooked and all that stuff. But that's not the kind of bread. That's a more modern thing for us to cook bread like that. They would cook unleavened bread, and it wouldn't puff up and have all these air pockets in it. It would be like this. By the way, my favorite bread is focaccia bread. Let me see if I can spell that for you. Foccoccia or something like that. And here in Pensacola on the Saturday, downtown Pensacola on Palafox Street, they line up both sides of the little walk in the middle of the road, and they have little booths and they sell food. And they sell that and they make it, and we buy it, and it's wonderful. And we buy some pesto. And pesto is olive oil, garlic, and what's the other thing? Oh, is it parsley? Not parsley. Oh, something green. Whatever. Basil. I believe it's basil. And we love to buy this focaccia bread and rip it up and dip it in that pesto. And that reminds me of, Jesus said, to whom I give sop. And that's sop. The old days, bread was a staple of what you ate. You ate bread at every meal. Sometimes you didn't have a meal. All you had, what you could carry as you're walking, so you'd carry a big loaf of bread. And you'd have something to dip it in. Sometimes you'd have cheese. And then sometimes you'd have grape juice. So it's interesting to me to think about what they would have eaten in those days. When I was in Spanish class, we had a really neat short story called Marcelino, Pan y Vino. Marcelino, pan, which is bread, and vino. Well, in Europe they drink fermented liquor, but in Jesus' day I believe they had wine, and it was new wine, so it was grape juice. And they would have a little thing made out of goat skin, like a canteen, and they'd probably carry some cheese and some butter and some bread, and maybe have a little olive oil too to dip it in. And that's how they ate. So I just find it amazing how you go to Europe today, and a lot of times in Europe they buy bread and cheese and wine, and that's what they live off of. Basically the kind of things they lived off of in Jesus' day. Now remember, Jesus wouldn't have drunk fermented liquor, I don't believe. So when we talk about wine in our King James Bible, it's grape juice, because he talks about wine spoiling and breaking the canteen and those kind of things. But it's interesting how things haven't changed much in the last 2,000 years. People still eat a lot of the same things. Sadly, here in America, our bread is processed. The best bread you can eat is what the Bible calls daily bread, where you grind it fresh and then eat it. The fresher the bread, the better it is for you. Well, anyway, I could keep going on and on and on about bread, but I wanted to show you that because as we continue next time, we get into the discourse of Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. And when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, you've got to remember that we talked about the bread of the feeding of the 5,000 before that. And that's what brought on the discussion that we're about to read in our next study. When we get into Jesus talking about eating bread, which is his body, and drinking blood, which is a type of wine. He's not saying, eat me as a cannibal. It's all having to do with the spiritual and having to do with what? With a belief of believing. So, can't wait to get into this next time. We'll talk more about the bread, and we'll continue our verse by verse study. I think I'll leave the map up here for us for next time. All right, see you next time. God bless. Bye-bye.